Okay.
Well, welcome. We have Liz from Normandy Equine back on our live, on our Facebook Live. Super exciting. Today we are talking about, Liz is starting to introducing her horses to us, and today we're going to start with Roulette, and she is going to talk about different things about the law of bone, the law of balance, a lot of those things, and I'm going to let you do all the talking, Liz, and I will see if I can keep you on track here.
Okay, that sounds great.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome to you from all the way from Kentucky. So we're back now in Normandy, back home where I live. So this is my property. And I'm here today with my son as well,
Hello.
Ross. And Ross is very kindly helping me by holding Roulette. So I'm just going to switch so that we can switch the screen so that we can see Roulette. Okay. And so what I'd like to do over the next few lives is I'd like to introduce my personal horses. So the horses that have come to me that I'm using as demo horses for the work that I do. So Roulette is an interesting horse. She was bred by accident. A very lovely lady who rescues horses had 7 mares. And she decided to put this 18-month-old Irish draft stallion in with them, thinking he was way too young to have babies. And a year later, she had 7 foals. So, and Roulette was one of them. So Roulette is quite an interesting mix. She is part Dartmoor. She's part thoroughbred, and her dad, of course, is Irish draft. So it took a long time for her to settle in her actual genetic makeup. The first couple of years, she really didn't have much of a chest. So this is the first winter where she actually, it's not the biggest chest in the world, but as you can see, it's actually developed. She does have pectorals. She has quite sort of large pectorals, really. And ever since that grew and her front legs separated a little bit, her balance improved. What's also interesting about Roulette is that if we can just, I'm just going to ask her to stand, well, actually, I'll go the other side. I'll go the other side because she's standing nicely on the other side. One of the things that people do when they're looking at a horse is that they'll look at the top line, which her top line's not too bad. She's got, you know, wither to croup, a really nice line, slightly lower behind than in front, which for dressage people would be quite lovely, although she is resting her back leg, so that might be a little bit deceiving. But what is really interesting about her, and now she's just swapped her leg as I came over here. Roulette, can you please do me a favor, sweetheart, and just stand on this leg, love? Okay, well, I'll go to the other side again then. So we're going to look at her elbow, and her elbow is right here. So this is the bone of the elbow. So it's the olecranon that is right at the end of the ulna. And then we're looking at that relationship to the relationship of the stifle. Hey, sweetie, I'm right here. So the stifle is right here. And what you would like is for the stifle and the front of the horse, the front leg, to not be hugely different. But if you're looking at Roulette, she's got quite a long hind limb. So if you go from the stifle down to the ground, it's quite long. And if you go from her elbow down to the ground, it's relatively long, but there's quite a difference between where the elbow is as opposed to where the stifle is. Now, those of you following these recordings and these lives, you will meet Bellum. Now, Bellum's totally different. He is much more even in the way that the bottom line is set up. So what I call these horses is a single down, which means that the top line is working relatively well. We'll look back at her top line again. So her top line from wither over to croup. Can you see that okay, Monique? I'm not sure if it can be, yeah. That's looking quite good. But the bottom line, you've got to realize that there's quite a differential between the stifle and the olecranon, or the ulna, or the elbow, which means that the horse is already sort of going downhill as she moves. And that is something we just have to take into consideration. I never look at a horse's conformation and go, oh, you know, and write them off. I just go, right, this is the horse I have in front of me, just like this is the rider I have or person I have in front of me. And then I make up my mind as to basically how we're going to develop that horse and its rider based on their temperament, based on, and I'm talking about both the rider and the horse, so their temperament, their conformation, their experience of life, their way that they approach different problems, etc. So it's not just a question of going, this particular horse and that particular rider will do, that the rules will apply to every horse and rider. That just doesn't work. Whatever science tells us, whatever people have discovered, they've only discovered it for maybe one horse or maybe 10 horses, but not for every rider horse combination there is. So that's something that's really important to understand, especially when you're looking at a horse like Roulette, who has a very interesting genetic makeup. She's not one breed, she's got 3 breeds hanging around in there. We're not doing any moving work today, but when you see her in movement, you would think of her watching her static, that she might have a pretty decent way of going. But actually, she's very grounded. She doesn't have any float to her way of moving. She's not a floaty trotter. She's going to be extremely correct in everything that she does in her work, but she is not an athletic superstar. She's just a superstar because she's just a lovely, lovely horse. The other thing about Roulette that's interesting is that she was weaned at home, and the weaning process was done simply by, at night, Mum was put in a stable next to her, which lasted for a while until they were both comfortable with that. Then Mum went away for a couple of months to another yard, and Roulette was then with another horse. And then Mum came back when everything was settled, and then Roulette lived with her mum and a couple of other horses until she was 2.5. So mentally, she's never had the trauma of being just one day Mum's no longer there. So she's always been a quiet, calm, opinionated. She's a very opinionated young lady. She's only 6 years old. But she's very calm, quiet, and brave, very intelligent, really finds it easy to figure out what it is that we want from her. So now what I'd like to move on to is just the mindset of the rider. So horses, and I'm going to flip back because we'll look back at Roulette in a minute, but I will, oh, it didn't do it. Flip the screen back, still didn't do it. Ah, there we go. Oh my goodness.
Technology.
Really good with technology, I am. Okay, so then I wanted to talk about the mindset of the rider. So riders, from the very beginning of their career, whether they start when they're 3 or whether they start when they're in their 20s or 30s, start gathering data. So every time we do something new, every time we live our lives, we're gathering data about certain different things. So when you start with horses, you're going to gather data from books, from instructors, from your own experience, from videos, from movies, from friends, and you're going to start making up your mind as to what you think is the truth about working with and around horses. So unfortunately, what happens is that a lot of these truths become really set and very habitual to us. So what we would call a paradigm, this is ideas we revisit, and they become a habit, a thought habit and a behavior habit. So anything that is a thought habit, of course, is deeply rooted in the subconscious and conscious of the rider. And this influences the behavior of the rider. So if the rider has a certain belief, for example, that to bend your horse, you have to use your inside leg because the horse bends around your leg, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. You will get results of some sort, and maybe those results will be relatively satisfying to you. Certainly, maybe one direction will be, but the other direction will always feel clumsy and difficult. That's because the horse doesn't bend in its back laterally. There is slight amounts of bend. I can't say that there's none, but it's so negligible that that is really not the way that horses bend their bodies, and we will get into that in a later recording. But what is to be understood is that the laws of riding are mutable. They're prone to change. And if you go on the internet these days, which is our main source of information, there's millions of different ways that people have developed to train horses. And I think it's very confusing, especially when you at home are sitting there on your own and you're getting huge amounts of advice from your friends. Your instructors are saying one thing, then other riders who you don't even barely know come up to you and start to tell you what they think you should do with your horse. So those things become really complicated and confusing. And what you really need to do is just study a little bit and find your own way. So my students say to me, well, how do I do that? And I say, well, there's two ways that you can really think about it. One way is you've got to look at the laws of nature. So nature has certain immutable laws, laws that cannot be broken. And then she has some laws that can be broken, but they're, of course, at your own risk and usually at the detriment of the horse. So laws, for example, that, as Monique mentioned, if you're looking at a bone, bones, for example, don't bend. That's one of the laws of nature. They don't bend. They do break, but they don't bend. The law of circulation. I wrote a whole article that I posted on my Facebook page that caused a lot of interesting response. Mainly people thinking, talking about whether or not you should use a bit, when really it had nothing to do with it. My big thing was that if the noseband is too tight, you're going to contravene the law of circulation. If you're putting anything on that's too tight, and if you do it to yourself, if you put on a bandage around your arm that's too tight, or an elastic around your wrist, or a ring on your finger, or whatever it is that's too tight, eventually your circulation can't flow. The blood can't flow, which means you are going to start to feel pain. And if you don't remove that thing that's causing you pain, you will then end up with necrosis. So that means the part of the body that's no longer receiving blood will die. That is a law. That is a law of nature. I don't care who you are. If you're a mammal on this planet, that is a law. You can't break it. So when people say to me, oh, but he really needs to have his noseband tight because he opens his mouth, this is a huge subject to talk about, but the one thing is for sure, you're breaking the law of circulation and you're causing your horse a lot of pain. All right. And people say, oh, but it's only on the bony part. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take the bony part of your wrist and tie something really tight around it. And I've done this with my students. And I've said, now imagine, and when it starts hurting, I say, now imagine if I said, well, I'm not taking it off. Sorry, you're just going to have to bear with it. So that's when they start to understand that actually it's not very nice.
That is actually how they remove the tails of sheep.
Yeah.
They tie something around it. That's
tails of sheep.
Against that law. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it is the testicles of certain different animals. Not a nice way of doing it, but they say to me always, oh well, they don't feel it. I'm like, okay, well, let's try it on you then. Especially if it's a male farmer. I'm like, how happy would you be if I start tightening up your elastics around your testicles? But anyway, that's another subject.
Let's go on.
And then the other laws that we're going to be looking at as we move through, and one of which my son, is going to be helping me with, who has studied science and is very bright. A bit of a Freudian slip, I know. But he will be talking to us about the law of gravity and how that has to be taken into consideration. Not that we need to become scientific experts, but just that if we understand certain basic rules about these laws, that when we then try to apply certain things to our horses, we're going to understand why the horse may or may not willingly be accepting what we're asking of it. And sometimes it's saying no, not because it's being ornery, but because it just cannot answer that question, because you are breaking one of the laws. And gravity is a pretty serious law, or a pretty serious force that is always applying its influence on us. So we're going to just wrap this up. Really, we're just saying that it's not science and or training methods can only get you so far with your horse. You've got to discover different tools and then you can apply them to your horse. If you've got a really good understanding of who you are, how you function, how the horse functions, mentally, physically, emotionally, the three things that are really important for both rider and horse, you will eventually be able to get much more harmony out of your relationship. And it's just starting to rain, so I think it's about time for us to say goodbye from Normandy.
You know, rain, you're not going to melt. Can you
Yeah.
quickly touch on the law of muscle?
The law of muscle, yes, I forgot the law of muscle. So muscles are very interesting. One of the things that people think is that muscles can push. Well, a muscle can only do one thing. When it contracts, it pulls. So there's always an agonist and an antagonist. That means there's one main muscle that changes the position of the joint. So, for example, your bicep closes your arm, but it's your tricep that opens it, not your bicep. So the muscle can only pull, it cannot push. Now, several groups of muscle or a muscle group working together can allow the owner of the muscle mass to push things, but a muscle in its own individual self cannot actually push. It can only pull. There's lots of other things to be said about muscles. Muscles, again, another great big huge realm of discussion, but we're just going to take it little bits at a time so people can really absorb this. But what I'd like to give you as a little homework is to go look at your horse and see if it's a double down, as in the wither is lower than the croup, and then the ulna or elbow is much lower than your stifle, because that will mean that your horse will need to be trained in a very specific way. Or is it a single down, where the the top line is really quite well balanced, but the lower line, the ulnar, is definitely much lower than the stifle, as we saw on Roulette? Or is it a single up? It's very rare that you have a double up, meaning that it's rare that the stifle is lower than in fact, I've never seen it, so I don't think it even exists. So, but have a look at your horses, and because we will be discussing what that means as how the horse balances themselves, and we will be combining that with what Ross will be telling us about gravity and centripetal force, which was a lesson I got this morning. Very interesting.
Nice. So can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm going to give you a little bit of homework as well. I know
Okay.
you're doing all the work here anyway. Could you make it, because you're a fantastic artist as well, can you just have an outline sketch of a horse that we can put in the comments, and that
Yes.
you can then print out and see where their horse is?
Ah, perfect. Yeah, I can do that. No problem. I will do that to you. No worries.
Yeah, excellent.
And again, if anybody watching this has any questions, please don't, be shy. Let us know, and we will answer them as part of these lives. Okay, fantastic.
Wonderful.
All right, well, listen, we'll probably see you again maybe Wednesday.
Yes.
Okay.
You're very
I have a friend here visiting from Australia, another horsey friend, so it might be fun to do a live with her. She's very interesting, actually, and she owns a Lipizzaner, so that's always quite a different breed. But anyway, so saying goodbye from me, Ross, and my beautiful
Roulette, thank you so much. This was very helpful, very informative, and we'll be back on Wednesday. Thank you.
Take care. Bye, Monique.
Bye.
Bye.